In 1879, at a quiet cottage in Richmond, a maid murdered her employer, boiled the body down to its bones, and then walked to the local pub to sell the dripping fat as lard. But the most chilling part, it nearly worked. The Thames knew first. On a bitter March morning in 1879, a fisherman near Barnes Bridge hauled something from the dark water that would stop London cold. A wooden box, nailed shut, wrapped in oilcloth. Heavy for its size. The kind of heavy that makes grown men step back. Inside, human remains, dismembered, partially cooked. No head, no hands, no identity. The press went mad. The Richmond Murder, the Barnes mystery, Cor Blimey, every rag in England screaming the same question. Who, and how, and why? In God's name, why? But the question nobody asked, the one that should have kept every Londoner awake at night, was this: had they already eaten her? By the end of this investigation, you'll understand how one woman, a convicted thief, an Irish maid, an outcast, nearly committed the perfect Victorian murder. You'll understand how a city of 5 million people missed it, how a trial became a spectacle, how a skull stayed hidden for 130 years. And you'll understand something far darker than the crime itself, how easy it was in Victorian England for certain women to simply disappear, and for no one to ask too many questions. Richmond, Surrey, 1879. Not the grand heart of empire, not the rookeries of the East End that filled the penny dreadfuls. Richmond was respectable, quiet, the sort of place where a widow could live alone without scandal, provided she dressed well and kept a servant. Julia Martha Thomas was 54 years old, twice widowed, a former school teacher of modest means but expensive habits. She wore jewelry to suggest a prosperity she didn't possess. Eccentric, her neighbors said. Tempestuous. She'd kept 7 maids in as many years, running through them like cheap coal. Kate Webster was 30 years old, born Kate Lawler in County Wexford, Ireland. She was a tall, strongly made woman, sharp-featured, large-toothed, with the kind of presence you notice in a room. She was also, by 1879, a seasoned criminal, convicted of larceny at 15, penal servitude at 19, Wandsworth prison twice over, a woman who had spent half her life behind bars and the other half in borrowed names: Webb, Gibbs, Gibbons, Lawler. She arrived at 2 Ving Cottages, Park Road, Richmond, on the 29th of January, 1879. In 32 days, Julia Thomas would be dead. But here's what the newspapers didn't tell you, and what makes this case so much more sinister than a simple killing in a cottage. Kate Webster had a plan, and it had already begun. From the first week, the 2 women were at war. Julia Thomas was a precise and maddening employer. She followed Webster through the cottage after every clean, running, gloved fingers along mantelpieces, redoing tasks she deemed insufficient. She criticized the cooking. She timed the errands. She made it plain, in 100 daily indignities, that a maid was not a person, merely a function. At first I thought her a nice old lady, but I found her very trying, and she used to do many things to annoy me during my work. Webster's response in those early weeks was to vanish. She'd slip out to Hay-Ho's public house on the Richmond Road, the hole in the wall some called it, and lose hours she should have spent scrubbing. Thomas found out. There were rows. Accusations. On at least one occasion, she threatened to sack Webster on the spot. The tension in that cottage was a lit fuse. Everyone could feel it. The neighbors could hear the raised voices through the walls. A rum affair, more than one of them would later say. On Sunday, the 2nd of March, 1879, Julia Thomas attended church. Evening service. She had recently dismissed Webster, given her formal notice. The working arrangement was ending. Thomas walked home through the Richmond dusk, opened her own front door, went upstairs to remove her hat. Kate Webster was waiting at the top of the stairs. What exactly happened in those moments has never been precisely established. The blow, or blows, a fall, a struggle. Webster would later speak of it only in fragments, always deflecting, always slightly changing the story. What is not in dispute by the time that Sunday night was over? Julia Martha Thomas was dead, and Kate Webster was already making calculations. Webster didn't flee, didn't panic, didn't run to the police confessing it was an accident. She lit the copper boiler in the scullery. She fetched her knives, and she worked through the night. The body of Julia Martha Thomas was dismembered. The flesh was boiled from the bones, the rendered fat. And here we must be precise, because this is the fact that broke Victorian England. The rendered fat was reportedly decanted into jars. But what happened to those jars? That is the open question, the one that nobody, not the police, not the jury, not the newspapers, ever fully answered. And it would not be answered for nearly a century and a half. By Monday morning, Kate Webster was wearing Julia Thomas's clothes, not metaphorically, literally. The dead woman's dresses, her jewelry, her silk gloves. Webster walked through Richmond as Mrs. Thomas, greeting neighbors, handling the household, playing the part of a respectable widow with such cool efficiency that for 2 full weeks, nobody thought to ask where the actual Mrs. Thomas had gone. Thomas, after all, was known for her eccentric travels. She disappeared for weeks at a time without notice. Her friends knew not to expect her. The neighbors assumed she was away again, somewhere on the continent, perhaps. It was brazen. It was, in its way, brilliant. But Webster was not idle during those 2 weeks. She was converting her crime into cash. She sold Julia Thomas's furniture, her silverware, her crockery. She visited the pawnbrokers and sold the gold bridgework she had extracted from Thomas's jaw before burning the bones. She sold the jewelry piece by piece. She even invited Thomas's acquaintances to come and purchase items from the house directly, presenting the sale as Mrs. Thomas's wish to downsize before a journey abroad. And she recruited help. A man named John Church, a publican she'd been intimate with, to move a large wooden box one evening. A heavy box. Church asked no questions. He helped Webster carry it to Richmond Bridge. They dropped it into the Thames. He walked home. He did not think about it again, not until the fishermen found it. I saw a woman at the door of Vine Cottages in the days following. She was taller than Mrs. Thomas. She wore Mrs. Thomas's hat and cape, I believe. But I thought perhaps I was mistaken. The box was opened. The remains were catalogued. The Thames Division detectives noted that whoever had done this had been deliberate, methodical, not frenzied. Someone who had time. Someone who was comfortable in that house. Word spread through Richmond with the speed of a foghorn on the river. People began to remember things. The woman at the door who didn't quite look right. The unusual sale of furniture. The strange smell that had drifted from Vine Cottages on that Sunday night. And someone remembered seeing Webster try to sell something at Hayhoe's pub. Jars of what she called best dripping. The landlord reportedly declined. He later said he didn't like the look of it. Whether he understood why he didn't like the look of it, we cannot say. But the police were now at the door, and Kate Webster was gone. She had fled back to Killan, back to County Wexford, back to the uncle she'd grown up near, a man named Marnie, living in the village where she was born as Kate Lawler 30 years before. She thought distance would save her. She thought the Irish Sea was wide enough. She was wrong. The Irish constabulary arrested her on the 29th of March, 1879. She was returned to London in chains. And now the investigation and its spectacular failures would be laid bare before the entire British public. Here is the problem the Crown faced when they attempted to build their case. They had a box of remains. They had a missing woman. They had a maid who had spent 2 weeks impersonating her employer, selling her possessions, and absconding to Ireland. What they did not have was Julia Thomas's head. Without the head, there was no definitive identification. The Victorian forensic sciences were in their absolute infancy. No fingerprints, no DNA, no reliable method of matching dismembered remains to a specific individual beyond visual recognition. The prosecution had to establish through circumstantial means that the remains in the river were Julia Martha Thomas. It was not as simple as it sounds. They had dental evidence, the gold bridgework Webster had pawned. They had testimony from Thomas's doctor about distinctive physical features. They had the oilcloth wrapping which matched material found in Vine cottages. But the head was missing, absent from the river, absent from the cottage, absent from anywhere the police could locate it. Where was Julia Thomas's head? That question hung over the trial like a Thames fog present, impenetrable, refusing to lift. Will you tell the court, Mrs. Webster, what became of the head of the deceased? I cannot say. I do not recollect. In 6 days of trial, Webster maintained this position with the maddening consistency of someone who had decided that admission was worse than mystery. Her defense attempted to cast doubt on the identification. Without the head, how could the Crown be certain these were the remains of Julia Martha Thomas and not some other unfortunate? It was a legally sound argument. It was also, to the public in the gallery, an obscenity. There was another dimension to this case that the penny papers had been quietly circling since March. The question of the dripping, the allegation, never proven at trial, never formally charged, was that Webster had offered rendered human fact to the publican at Hayhoe's and to neighbors and to children in the street, that she had sold it or given it away as cooking lard. Had people unwittingly consumed Julia Martha Thomas? The Crown did not press the charge. The evidence was too uncertain. The witnesses too reluctant. Victorian sensibility could only absorb so much before the machinery of justice itself began to buckle. But the rumor was in the air, and it never entirely left it. What Webster's defense could not answer, what nobody in that courtroom could satisfactorily explain, was this: if Webster was innocent, where had she been during the 2 weeks when she wore a dead woman's clothes, sold a dead woman's possessions, and loaded a dead woman's body into a box? The jury required barely an hour. October 2010, 131 years after Kate Webster carried a wooden box to Richmond Bridge. Workers were carrying out renovation at a property in Vine Road, Richmond, the garden of a house that had, by a peculiar turn of fate, become the residence of Sir David Attenborough. They unearthed a skull, a human skull buried at some depth in good Victorian London clay that had preserved it rather well. Female, middle-aged, consistent with the mid to late 19th century. Forensic anthropologists examined it. Forensic odontologists examined it, and slowly, painstakingly, the evidence accumulated. The skull belonged to a woman of approximately 50 to 60 years of age. The bone structure was consistent with descriptions of Julia Martha Thomas. And here is where you must rethink everything you thought you understood about this case. The location, not in the river, not lost to the Thames, not dissolved in some Victorian lime pit, buried in a garden barely a quarter-mile from Vine cottages, as though someone had walked down the road one night, dug a hole, and simply left her there, hidden but not discarded, near but not obvious, as though the person who buried it intended someday to know where it was. The open question that hung over the 1879 trial, "Where is the head?" was answered by a building project in the 21st century, and now revisit the earlier allegation. The dripping, the jars offered at Hayhoe's pub. If Webster had the head, had kept the head, had buried it nearby, she was not a frenzied killer erasing evidence in a panic. She was someone who maintained control of her crime with extraordinary precision, someone organized, deliberate, someone who knew exactly what she had done and where she had put it. The person who declined to press the lard allegation at trial wasn't wrong to be cautious. But consider what the buried skull tells us. Kate Webster was more calculating than anyone in 1879 fully grasped. And the skull also means something else, something darker. For 131 years, a woman's head lay in the ground while the world above it carried on. Children played nearby, houses were built and sold and bought again. A famous naturalist tended his garden. Julia Martha Thomas could not be wholly identified until 2010, could not be wholly buried until then, could not, in some genuine sense, fully rest. The law had done its work in 1879, but justice, proper, complete justice, waited a century and a quarter in the cold London clay. The trial at the Old Bailey ran 6 days, beginning the 9th of July, 1879. Kate Webster sat in the dock and watched the Crown dismantle her life before a packed courtroom. They brought the pawnbrokers who had bought Thomas's jewelry. They brought the neighbors who had noticed the strange woman in Mrs. Thomas's clothes. They brought John Church, who told the court about the heavy box and the Richmond Bridge and the question he hadn't asked. Webster's defense presented their arguments. The identification was uncertain, the circumstantial nature of the evidence. Without the head, who could say with certainty? The jury took 55 minutes to find her guilty. The judge sentenced her to death. Webster's response as she left the dock was to claim pregnancy, a plea that would trigger a jury of matrons, an ancient legal mechanism by which 12 married women of good character would examine the accused and determine whether she was with child. She was not. The matrons returned their verdict within the hour. The execution was set. On the night before her execution, the 28th of July, 1879, Kate Webster finally confessed. Not the full confession one might expect, not the map to the skull or the full account of the dripping, but she admitted at last that she had killed Julia Martha Thomas, that there had been a struggle on the stairs, that she had struck her, that she had then done what was necessary to conceal the act. Necessary. Her word, necessary. She was hanged at Wandsworth Prison on the morning of the 29th of July, 1879. She was 30 years old. Outside the gaol, a crowd had gathered, not the baying mob of earlier executions, but a cluster of the curious. People who had followed every column inch of the Richmond murder and wished, perhaps, to mark the moment. Some among them had read the allegations about the dripping. Some of them had wondered, privately and with a horror they could not quite voice, whether someone they knew had bought a jar. They stood in silence as the appointed hour arrived, and then they went home, back to their Victorian streets and their Victorian certainties, back to the comfortable story that justice had been served, the evil punished, the danger buried. Except that Julia Thomas's head was still out there, and nobody knew where to look. There is something that the Richmond murder reveals, not about Kate Webster, but about Victorian England itself. Julia Thomas could vanish for 2 weeks without a single person alerting the authorities. Her eccentric habits, her social awkwardness, her solitary nature. These were the very qualities that made her murder possible. The city of 5 million souls had no mechanism to notice when one unremarkable woman stopped moving through it. And Kate Webster could impersonate her, could walk through Richmond in a dead woman's dress for a fortnight, because the social expectation of female domesticity made it believable. A woman running a household, selling its contents, preparing for a journey abroad. Nothing to see. The Victorian age prided itself on order, on empire and institution and the proper arrangement of things. And in that very pride lay the cracks, the places where violence could take root and flourish undetected in the very heart of respectable England. The skull found in 2010 is not merely a forensic footnote. It is a reminder that the past does not always finish when we decide it does. That buried things surface, eventually, in gardens, in rivers, in archives, in memories, that some forms of justice run on their own clock entirely. Kate Webster is gone. Julia Thomas is finally wholly known. The Richmond murder is solved, fully, only in our century. But the questions it raises about who we see, who we overlook, whose disappearance we notice, and whose we don't, those questions have not aged a day. If this case has stirred something in you, if you believe forgotten crimes deserve to be remembered, subscribe to Victorian Dark Mysteries. A new investigation drops every week. And if you've made it this far, you already know this channel is different.